Trump and his co-conspirators try to reach out to members of Congress before January 6th and on January 6th of 2021?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what your investigation uncovered regarding communications with members of Congress that's related to the attack on the Capitol on January 6th?
There was pretty extensive contact with members of Congress. There were instances of members of Congress, again, specifically on January 6th, but also before that, where either they were reaching out to the White House or the White House was reaching out to them, and through conduits to the president, including, as I said, Mark Meadows.
Okay. And what was the nature? Let's start with before January 6th. What was the nature of some of these communications with the White House or with co-conspirators of Donald Trump leading up to January 6th and members of Congress?
Well, it varied. Sometimes the communications were relevant to us to show that people were telling Donald Trump that the things he was saying were not true. Other times they were evidence of the false nature of the things that we're saying. So for an example would be, there are 2 voicemails that Rudy Giuliani left for senators, and those voicemails show him saying things that were not true, using knowingly false claims to try to get those senators to further delay the certification of the vote.
Now, you just mentioned that there were instances before January 6th of members calling the White House, and I'm summarizing, to basically express that some of the claims the president and his co-conspirators were making were not true. Is that what you just said?
Well, I should be specific. There were a variety of reasons and I'm not trying to say that any time someone contacted the White House, they were involved in a crime themselves or doing anything improper. But how this conspiracy that was trying to stop the lawful transfer of power, how that worked, it was important for us to understand. We had evidence from Department of Justice officials that Donald Trump said to them, just say the election is corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. I think given that was the perspective that Donald Trump had, our view is that the case we would have presented at trial would have been Donald Trump preying on the party allegiance of people in his party. And people like the vice president didn't agree to that. People like the elector from Pennsylvania I mentioned didn't agree to that. People like the Speaker of the House in Arizona didn't agree to that. But the extent to which those contacts were happening was relevant to our investigation.
Okay, so let's dig down a little bit in that. Let's start on January 6th. So I believe in the evening, did your investigation uncover or learn that Mr. Trump personally called members of Congress on the evening of January 6th?
Yes.
Do you remember who those members were?
I'd have to look at the records to be sure, but the best of my recollection, he was trying to get in touch directly himself with Senator Hawley and Senator Hagerty. And then there were several senators who he directed Rudy Giuliani to get in touch with.
And who were those senators that Mr. Trump directed Mr. Giuliani to get in contact with, to the best of your recollection?
To the best of my recollection, and this comes from a email, or I think it was a text maybe, that Boris Epstein sent to Mark Meadows, and it basically said something to the effect of, the president told the mayor to call these senators and they needed numbers. And what our investigation ultimately showed was they sent that text after they'd already started trying to call members and didn't think they had, and ended up understanding that they didn't have the right phone numbers. In fact, the message that they left for Senator Lee, which he voluntarily provided to our office, that was meant for Senator Tuberville, I believe. And the message that he left for Senator Sullivan, I believe it was for Senator, the name's escaping me now, but it was another senator that he meant to call. We had also interviewed Boris Epstein before these subpoenas were issued. He corroborated that they were, in fact, trying to call senators. he dissembled and tried to imply that the president hadn't directed him to do it, even though there was a text message saying specifically that they had. But he agreed that they tried to call these senators and that they had certain senators' numbers themselves, and so they didn't need those numbers. And that would be, I believe it was Senator Cruz, and possibly, I think he said they possibly tried to call Senator Graham as well.
Taking a step back, this might be obvious for a lot of folks, but just to make sure it's clear for the record, who was Mr. Epstein?
Boris Epstein was one of the co-conspirators in this case.
And what role did Mr. Epstein play in the larger conspiracy, if you can summarize it?
Well, he played several roles. He was involved in the fake elector scheme, and also in sort of pushing out some of these false fraud claims. The other thing, I'm sorry, just to go back to mention is, we also, in the course of the investigation, interviewed Rudy Giuliani. And one of the things that we asked him, if you recall, in the message, I can't remember which senator it was for, but in the message that he left, he said, referenced the fact that he was calling on fellow Republicans. And in the interview, we asked him, why did you say you were calling on your fellow Republicans? And he said, well, I wasn't going to be calling Democrats about this. Even some Republicans wouldn't go along with this. And so, of course, I would call only Republicans. And in fact, that was consistent with our investigation throughout, that the people that President Trump and his co-conspirators reached out to were people who they thought would go along or help them because of party allegiance. And Giuliani in particular would reference that he expected their cooperation because they were Republicans. There was one particular meeting that he attended where he got a hostile reception because he had no evidence to back up the fraud claims. And he said something to the effect of, I thought we were all Republicans here. And so that was a theme throughout the case, and it went to the strength of the case that we had, because the witnesses we were going to call were the people that the president reached out to sort of further this criminal scheme.
I want to touch on a point, because it seems like the evidence you uncovered showed certain members of Congress, including Republicans, pushing back on this assertion about the big lie. And I'm characterizing some of these claims about the election as the big lie. Is that okay if I use that term?
You can use whatever term you like.
Oh, I'm going to use the big lie. So do you recall any evidence when you were talking to Mr. Giuliani that he truly believed all the voter fraud claims that he was putting out around the country?
Our evidence was he did not. And in fact, when we interviewed him, he disavowed a number of the claims. He claimed they were mistakes or hyperbole. Even the claim about Ruby Freeman, where he, basically destroyed this poor woman's life by claiming she was a vote scammer. President Trump did the same thing in a recorded call with the Secretary of State. He disavowed things he'd said in that interview. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Were you able to interview some of the individuals that our January 6th committee was unable to interview? For example, did you interview Mark Meadows?
We did.
We were unable to talk to Mr. Meadows. Were you able to find out what the communication was between Mr. Meadows and Mr. Bannon and potentially Mr. Stone on the evening of January 5th at the so-called war room at the hotel?
I don't recall that as I sit here right now. I know Mr. Meadows spoke to a number of people who were either involved in or adjacent to this conspiracy. As I sit here right now, I don't recall that specific evidence. I think he was in touch with Bannon, but I don't recall specifically the answer to that question.
Mr. Bannon made an extraordinary video basically predicting the events of January 6th on the day before. Were you able to discover, either by interviewing Mr. Bannon or those who had knowledge of what he was doing, how he was aware of the riot before it happened?
We did not interview Mr. Bannon. I believe that particular statement you're talking about would have been part of our proof, and my recollection is that we had evidence that would indicate from some point, not immediately after the election, but shortly thereafter, sometime might have been closer to December period, that Bannon, who had been out of touch with President Trump for some period of time, got back in more regular touch with him at some time. And in fact, this is reminding me, my recollection is that we had a text thread that between Bannon and Epstein that went through a lot of this period. On that text thread, I believe it was the evening of January 6th, right around the time the senators' calls were occurring at the direction of the president. And there was an exchange between those two where I believe it was Epstein asked Bannon, are you in touch with him? And the answer was affirmative, and it was something to the effect of, he's still on fire. And that's right at the same time that these calls are happening, after he refused to do what he could to stop the attack on the Capitol, after the tweet about Mike Pence.
In December, there were several meetings in the White House where efforts were to overthrow the election were discussed in terms of the fake elector scheme. The president issued his tweet calling the mob to Washington that it would be wild. Did you identify members of Congress who participated in any of those meetings?
Participated in meetings at the White House.
In December?
I'm thinking now, I can't say that we didn't, but as I sit here right now, I can't think of a member of Congress in particular that attended the meetings I'm thinking of right now. Not saying it didn't happen, I just don't have a
I want to
recollection.
follow up on that. There was a December 18th meeting. Do you remember a December 18th meeting at the White House right before President Trump then issued the "Will Be Wild" tweet in the early morning of December 19th? Do you remember I believe Ms. Powell was there and others were at the White House discussing with Mr. Trump?
I remember there was a meeting with Sidney Powell where there was a discussion about whether she would be appointed a sort of special counsel to sort of have this role that would assist Trump in pushing these claims of election fraud that were false. My recollection of that is the meeting ended, I believe, with President Trump saying, I want her in that position, but then it didn't happen because she didn't fill out the paperwork, clearance paperwork necessary for that. I don't know if that's the 18th, but it's around that time.
And do you recall any members, just following on Ms. Laughlin's point, do you recall any members of Congress being present or participating in that meeting?
There's a record of this in our files. I remember certain individuals. I think Mark Meadows was there. An individual by the name of Eric Hirschman was there. I think Rudy Giuliani was there. There was a number of people there. I'm not remembering if there's anybody in particular you can ask me and I can see if I could remember, but that's what I remember now.
Who introduced the idea of Mr. Clark becoming Attorney General?
Our investigation determined that Congressman Perry had a role in getting Jeff Clark on the radar of President Trump as someone who could help him, and getting meetings with Jeff Clark and the president.
And we might touch on Mr. Perry's involvement later on. Just want to flag that for you. So it sounds like, and I want to hear it from you, did your request for the toll records of certain congressional members, did that relate to phone calls made to these members of Congress on or around January 6th of 2021?
Including that, yes.
And how big was the window of records that you requested for these members of Congress?
The records regarding those calls on January 6th, the period of time was from, I believe it was January 4th to 7th, but there was earlier subpoenas, including the one referenced earlier today regarding Congressman McCarthy. There was a broader period of time from, I want to say it's about November 3rd through, again, it was either January 6th or 7th.
And I've heard you mention evidence such as text messages with Mr. Epstein, Mr. Giuliani. Did you also have Mr. Giuliani's records as part of your investigation? Did you collect those? Phone records, I mean?
We did.
Okay. So in your prosecutorial experience, do you generally seek to obtain call records from both individuals involved in a telephonic call or message?
We do, and in this case, with the records for that evening, it was particularly important because when we interviewed Boris Epstein, one of the things that came out was that Rudy Giuliani had two phones, and that Boris Epstein had another phone, and we needed to make sure that we weren't missing any calls in terms of where the calls came from. And so it would corroborate the records that we had, but also make sure that there's not calls that we missed.
Did you ever learn why Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Epstein had multiple phones?
No.
Did the toll records that you requested from the senators, did they include the content of the phone calls?
No.
The records that you requested, the toll records from the members of Congress, include the content of text messages?
No.
Can you explain for us on the record what information generally is included in a toll records request?
Sure. Again, my understanding from a prosecutor's perspective is it is non-content information. It's generally about when the call started, when the call stopped. That would include obviously the duration of the call and who the call is to and who the call is from. That's the basic information that you want to get from a toll records subpoena.
Then let's fast forward to, say this would have gone to a trial. How would you, in your experience, have used this type of evidence in a trial?
Oh, it would have been relevant in a number of ways. So it would have been relevant. You could put it together in a summary chart to show the series of contacts, and it could be relevant to show the campaign that evening to reach out to senators to delay the proceedings. It could also be relevant to show, for example, on the afternoon of January 6th, of notice that there was notice that violence was going on. Congressmen, both Republican and Democrat, and the Vice President were in danger. That text records would make that incontrovertible that those calls actually happened. They'd also be relevant for examining witnesses, whether it would be a prosecution witness who might not remember exactly when a call happened, or a defense witness, for example, if any of the co-conspirators were to testify, which, as I mentioned before, was something we would have welcomed. We would have had toll records to question them about the calls that they made, the calls that they received, things of that nature, which in my experience can be very effective.
Can I ask, we attempted in the January 6th committee to question Peter Navarro as well as Steve Bannon, and they were both prosecuted and spent time in jail. Roger Stone appeared but took the fifth. Were you able to provide, to get information from any of those three individuals, and in the case of Mr. Stone, provide use immunity so that he would have to testify?
We did not.
Why not?
We pursued the investigative routes that we thought were the most fruitful. We pursued those that we thought were necessary to get a complete understanding of the scope of the conspiracy. And given the highly uncooperative nature of the individuals you talked about, I didn't think it would be fruitful to try to question them. And the sort of information that they could provide us, in my view, wasn't worth immunizing them for their own possible conduct.
Going back to the toll records, I just want to make sure we make a few things clear. When you were requesting toll records, did it mean that DOJ or FBI was conducting surveillance on members of Congress?
No.
When you were collecting toll records, did it mean that DOJ or FBI would be able to wiretap phone calls made by members of Congress?
No.
Yes, I want to actually go back to some of the lines of questioning that you endured by the majority. There seemed to be this insinuation that there was a lack of respect for the defendant's schedule. Do you recall kind of some of that line of questioning?
I recall questions about his schedule, yes.
Okay. I just want to level set because this is going to be a record and it may be public one day. Considering all the years of experience that you have prosecuting, is it more often or less often that you've had a defendant that has been charged in 4 different jurisdictions with crimes?
I don't know if I've had that before, but it certainly hasn't been often.
Okay. And as it relates to these 4 jurisdictions, we know that he was charged not only on the federal level, but he was also charged on the state level, correct?
That's correct.
And in your experience, typically has it been that if you have a defendant that is charged in multiple federal cases that the federal magistrates or the sitting judges typically confer and figure out scheduling conflicts?
That can happen, yes.
Okay. The issue in this case, or a number of issues in this case, was not so much your prosecution, but was the fact that there was alleged criminal conduct all over the place, correct?
Well, I was focused on my case and my prosecutions.
Okay. So, I guess what I'm trying to figure out how I want to do this because they were doing this a different way. Essentially, did it seem as if President Trump was actually enjoying privileges that the average defendant did not?
I certainly wouldn't want that to be the case. I think the law should be the same for everybody. I don't think anybody should be above the law. I think in a case like this, that could be challenging, but it was my goal to make sure he was treated as anybody else, as any of us would be treated.
So let me ask you this, because in my experience, I've never had a defendant have so many charges and not spend one day in jail. In your experience, have you ever had a defendant charged with so many cases and not spend one day in jail? And when I'm talking about a day in jail, I'm talking about pre-incarceration. What I was observing is that the president was experiencing walkthroughs for seemingly every case that he got instead of going through the typical process that a defendant would normally go through.
Well, I have to say in our cases, in terms of, we did not try our cases. We did not prove our cases in a court beyond a reasonable doubt. And so any sort of sentence, whether it would be incarceratory or otherwise, we never reached that point in the proceedings. And in our case, whether someone would be detained before trial, there's factors you look to for that. We did not ask for President Trump to be detained before trial. And so, as I think I've made clear, I wish we had been able to try these cases because I am confident we had the proof to sustain convictions. And I did try at every place to make sure he was not being treated better or worse than anybody else. But with respect to those things, that was the state of the record in our case.
You've tried cases on the state level, correct?
I have.
Okay. So he was charged in Georgia as well as New York. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And in your experience in handling trial cases on the state level, typically, and correct me if I'm wrong, typically a defendant is incarcerated and then given a bail or not to get out. Has that been your experience as it relates to the trial level on the state level?
Depending on the charge, yes. And obviously the charge depends on what the bail level is.
Correct, correct. Okay.
I just have one more question about the toll records. So in this past October, in a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing with Attorney General Bondi, Senator Josh Hawley claimed that the subpoena of his phone records was, quote, tapping his phone. As part of your investigation, did you or anyone from your office tap the phone of Senator Hawley?
No.
So is his suggestion that his phone had been tapped just simply false?
It's inaccurate.
Okay, thank you.
I believe earlier, and we're turning back to January 6th, the conspiracy leading up, the events on January 6th, and I believe earlier you said that the reason why, and I'm paraphrasing here, that you charged the president was that he was the most culpable person related to the crime of attempting to criminally overturn the 2020 election. Do you recall saying words to that effect earlier today?
Yes, and because we had proof beyond a reasonable doubt and met the requirements in the federal principles of prosecution.
And I believe you said some of the false claims he was putting out created a certain level of distrust about the validity of the election of 2020. Do you recall saying something like that as well?
Correct. That's alleged in the indictment.
Great. So I want to start with how that level of distrust was created. In your report, you say, and this is a quote, "The through line of all Mr. Trump's criminal efforts was deceit, knowingly false claims of fraud." Can you generally describe some of these knowingly false claims of fraud that were spread after the 2020 election?
Sure. There's a number of them. And part of the explanation is why they're false. And so, just off the top of my head, an example is he was on notice in this election that in Pennsylvania, for example, that he would be ahead in the vote count for a period of time, and then when the mail-in ballots were counted, his lead would dissipate. He chose to represent that phenomena that he'd been briefed on, that was normal course of an election, that all sides knew that that's how it was going to be. He chose to present that as evidence of fraud. And to people who are not maybe as informed as him or informed as his campaign managers who told him these things, that's the sort of thing that creates distrust. There were fraud claims in Michigan, Georgia, where he was specifically disabused by people he trusted, by political allies, by the people when he chose to call them who are best situated to know. In Georgia, I'm thinking of the Secretary of State. He reflexively rejected those things and continued to state false things after he'd been told that repeatedly that they weren't true.
And why was it important? It probably goes to the mindset, but why was it important of all of these repeat statements from individuals that Donald Trump's claims were untrue? How did that play into your overall investigative findings?
Well, I think the pattern and the depth of the pattern and the length of the pattern was pretty damning evidence that he knew these things were false. He only brought fraud claims that involved states that he'd lost. He only approached people generally who had party allegiance to him. When he was told that a fraud claim wasn't true, he didn't stop making it. Another example I can give is that Sidney Powell, who's alleged as one of the co-conspirators, was part of his team at the beginning of this conspiracy. Shortly after, she began making statements that really nobody could credit, that were facially false. And at some point, Giuliani made a statement that she wasn't on the legal team anymore. And Trump, at one point, was on a call, President Trump, where he basically, if I recollect it right, he muted the call and said she was crazy. But then after that point, he continued to promote her fraud claims and lawsuits. He considered putting her as a special counsel, even though he'd admitted, he used the word crazy, and the statement she was making could, by any reasonable person, be viewed as true. And so I think that sort of like claims that were so outlandish and so just fantastical, continuing to push those sort of claims after they've been disabused was strong evidence of our case.
It seems like the evidence that your case uncovered was, I think you said Mr. Trump contacting mostly or all Republican officials about his voter claims from the election of 2020. Is that correct?
That's my recollection. As I sit here now, I can't think of anyone who wasn't someone who was loyal to him politically. And again, many people who would have been our witnesses rejected his entreaties to do that. And again, I think it was in Michigan and in Arizona, and also the Attorney General in Georgia had stated, I voted for him twice. I wanted, and others stated, I wanted him to win, I campaigned for him. So it's not as if it was effective in every place, but that was who he focused this at, and that's why I had said earlier today that the witnesses in this case, the subjects of the toll records in this case, those were chosen by President Trump.
So if President Trump would have pressured, for example, a Democratic state leader about these false claims of the election, would you have looked into that Democratic state member as well?
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier talking about individuals pushing back on these false claims. When you're talking about the fake electors, you mentioned a congressman from Pennsylvania who I guess would have been a witness who might have pushed back on the fake elector scheme being legal. Do you recall saying that earlier?
I do.
Who was that member?
My recollection, I think his name was Thomas Marino. He was a former U.S. attorney, and he's a Republican, former congressman, and he had agreed to be, and this is before the election, agreed to be an elector for Donald Trump. And when he was presented with this idea of the fake elector scheme, my recollection of his reaction was that this was an attempt to overthrow the government, and it was illegal.
You also mentioned a few of the states that Mr. Trump and his co-conspirators, such as Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell, targeted about these false claims about the election. Do you recall which states were the main targets of this group?
Yes, I believe it was 7 states. Let me count them. Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona. I'm missing one because New Mexico was memorable because he lost that by 10%. There's one more I'm forgetting.
Nevada?
Nevada, thank you.
And I just want to confirm Nevada was the last state. Is that
That's
correct,
correct.
sir? Did your investigation uncover why Mr. Trump and individuals like Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell might have selected these 7 states?
Well, the states were all states that he lost by a pretty small margin, except for, again, New Mexico was 10%. I mean, depends what you define as small, but the others were all much closer than that.
And these states had all voted in support of Mr. Biden being president, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. So just to be clear, Donald Trump had lost all 7 of these states, but it appears narrowly, depending on how you define narrowly.
that's correct.
One of the bigger parts of your report, and which you've talked about here today, comes down to the knowledge, Mr. Trump's knowledge that he had lost the election. I know you've talked about it at various stages of today, but I would just like a pretty clear answer, if you don't mind, about what evidence did you collect about Mr. Trump's knowledge that he had indeed lost the election of 2020?
Okay. Well, there are 2 types of knowledge. One, that he lost the election, and another, that the things he was saying, the fraud claims were in fact false.
And I want to start with the first one, that
Yeah.
you said that he had lost the election.
Yeah, I think, again, it's the same sort of bucket of evidence that he was repeatedly told by people that the very fraud claims that would change the outcome were not true. As you may remember, when he was told by his campaign team, in essence, that if you can't win Arizona, you can't win the election, and then he lost Arizona, he changed out that team and went with Giuliani and his group. We also had statements from other individuals. I believe it was General Mark Milley who said he was going to leave this for the next guy. There was another staffer who overheard him saying that something to the effect of, and I want to make sure I'm not inaccurate here, it's in our final report, but basically, like, you keep fighting regardless of whether you won or lost, things of that nature, which were corroborative of the very strong evidence of that the things he was saying about the election claims were not true.
And then you said earlier, when I asked you the original question, I thank you for parsing out the various knowledge, right? The second part was that Mr. Trump knew that his claims were false. And in the report, you say that Mr. Trump, and this is a quote, knowingly made false claims. So I'm assuming that talked about the false claims he made after he knew that he had lost the election. Can you describe or summarize some of these false claims he made to the American public after he knew that he had lost the election?
Sure. These would be false claims about dead voters. It would be false claims about underage voters. It would be false claims about illegal alien voters. The false claims were generally, as a general matter, about urban centers where he had lost the vote in a particular state that was otherwise close by a lot. Yes, and again, these were claims that were rebutted by people around him who knew that they were false, and in many cases told them they were false.
Go to January 6th itself. The president gave a speech on the rally, and we received information, testimony, that a couple of things, that his supporters were leaving their weapons outside the magnetometers because they couldn't go through, and also that at some point Mr. Trump said, let them come through anyhow because they're not going to hurt me. It was subsequent to that knowledge that some of these supporters were armed, that he called on them to go to the Capitol. Was that set of facts subject to your investigation and review?
I recall what you're talking about. I remember we interviewed different people who were we interviewed people who were near or around President Trump in that period of time before the ellipse speech. And on that point, there were different recollections and different points of view. Some people said what you said. Other people had more innocuous explanations about why people stayed outside the magnetometers. Clearly, people did stay outside the magnetometers. You could see that in the video of the crowd. So I do recall that. And as I said, I remember different people hearing different parts of that and having different perspectives on it.
Metropolitan Police, as well as Secret Service, identified a number of people who were armed along the route, some of them in trees. Did you get information about that?
I don't recall. I do recall there were people who certainly had weapons at the Capitol. That I recall with certainty. And there's people who used weapons, whether they be poles or sticks or other weapons, against police officers. I know there was one officer who they took his gun. And so the use of weapons against members of law enforcement, it was outrageous, but it figured heavily in what happened at the Capitol that day.
I'm actually, if you don't mind, I believe it's Exhibit 10. It's your volume 1 of your report. I think we entered it as an exhibit earlier, and I'm going to direct you to page 39 of your report. And I'm going to focus on the middle paragraph. There's 3 different paragraphs on this page. I'm going to focus on the middle one that starts with Mr. Trump's intent in spreading knowing falsehoods. Do you see that paragraph, Mr. Smith?
Yes, this was this paragraph was what I was referring to when I spoke earlier.
That's what I thought. Did President Trump ever acknowledge, and I believe you talked about it in this paragraph, but did President Trump ever acknowledge that he knew that he had actually lost the election of President Biden?
Yeah, so this paragraph references different statements that he made in the presence of other people. One is that it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still fight like hell. And then the other was, can you believe I lost to this effing guy?
So,
Referring to Joe Biden.
so if this would have gone to a trial, and using your years of experience being a prosecutor and a trial attorney, how would you have argued this admission to Mr. Trump? Or how could you? What's a way you could have argued this admission from Mr. Trump to a jury?
Well, I think I saw these admissions as corroborative of the larger case. We would have presented what I viewed as very strong witnesses from each state to explain how the elections occurred in that state and why the events, the outcomes were trustworthy, and debunking various fraud claims that President Trump made. We would have presented the false claims that he made repeatedly, interspersed with debunkings to him or other evidence that showed they weren't true and that evidence got to him. This sort of evidence would corroborate that, but it would sort of be the cherry on top, if you will. The evidence that I felt was most powerful was the evidence that came from people in his own party who, as I said earlier, put country before party and were willing to tell the truth to him, even though it could mean trouble for them. I think witnesses like that, in my experience, would be very powerful witnesses in front of a jury, and this sort of evidence that you're pointing to here would be extra, but I think those other witnesses would be very strong proof.
And I want you to elaborate a little bit on that, on your experience with these types of witnesses. I'm assuming, individuals in the same party as Mr. Trump pushing back on his assertions of voter fraud and various other claims. Why would that, in your opinion, have been powerful to present to a jury?
Well, I think someone who puts country before party, I think my understanding of people, of jurors, that people appreciate that. I know I certainly do. The other part about that is the reality of, like, when people speak out against their political party, there can be costs. And when people are willing to pay those costs because they believe in something, because they're going to tell the truth, I think people get that. And I think the witnesses I'm talking about, if I had to cross-examine them and make them not look credible, that would be very hard. I think that would be a very hard assignment.
You mentioned just now, as part of your trial strategy would have been, having individuals from each state come up and talk about their experiences, pushing back on Mr. Trump's false claims about the election. And one of those states you mentioned earlier was Pennsylvania. And so I do want to give Ms. Scanlon from Pennsylvania a chance to ask a few questions.
Thank you. Appreciate you being here. And certainly we were paying very close attention to this whole process in Pennsylvania, since Pennsylvania was one of the main targets for the president's attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Can you just outline for us what actions President Trump, if any, took in Pennsylvania, a state that Joe Biden clearly won, in the 2020 presidential election, to overturn its results and gain the electoral votes for himself?
Sure. Like the other 6 states involved, there were knowing false statements about fraud claims. You're testing my memory here, but one was, I remember there was a persistent claim that more people had voted than had been given ballots. And it was a very clear thing that we were talking about 2 different elections. And there's email traffic among his staff and people who work for him about how obvious this wasn't true. And persistently kept making that statement over and over again. I also remember in Pennsylvania, the chair of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, a guy by the name of, I think his name was Tabbas, very shortly after the election, this isn't I want to say, mid to early November, disabused President Trump of the idea that the reason his vote total, his lead was going down was because of fraud. And he explained again, that's how, we all knew that's how this was going to work with absentee ballots in the state of Pennsylvania, which we had very strong evidence that Trump, in fact, had been briefed upon by his campaign staff. So those aren't the only examples, but they're the ones that come to mind as I sit here now.
You have a really good memory, but that first one you mentioned, the claim that there were more ballots being cast than had been issued, is one that some of our colleagues here have repeated, despite the fact that the entire state election apparatus has contested it for 5 years now. I think your report mentions the conversation that the president had with Larry Thomas, the chair of the Republican Party, in which he explained to him just a couple days after the election concluded why Pennsylvania's system had all these absentee ballots, which Democrats had embraced because the president had told Republicans not to use them. Did the fact that the chair of the Pennsylvania Republican Party told the president that there was nothing fraudulent about the fact that the Democrats' vote total was continuing to grow, did that stop the president from continuing his efforts to promote claims of voter fraud in Pennsylvania or elsewhere?
It did not, but again, that witness, Mr. Tabbas, was of a similar group of witnesses who, these are not enemies of the president, these are people in his party who supported him. And I think the fact that they were telling him these things would have had, in my view, would have had great weight and great credibility with the jury.
It's kind of the principle that we use in the law of an admission against interest, you know, when your party loyalty leads you to support the president, but instead you're saying no, he's wrong. You think that might give them credibility?
Yeah, I think witnesses of that nature would have had very strong credibility.
I agree. I know some of these folks. Did President Trump try to carry out his fraudulent elector plan in Pennsylvania as well?
Yes.
And how did he do this?
Well, what happened with the elector plan was when they came up with the idea of having these fake electors, there were certain electors who would just not put up with it. Thomas Marino, I think he was from Pennsylvania, is an example of that. And so as a result, and he wasn't the only one in the scheme generally, as a result they had to replace electors. And again, just to keep in mind, all the electors we're talking about here are people who supported Donald Trump. These are people who signed up and said, I want to be an elector for Donald Trump. And these people, when they stepped out, they had to replace them. And part of what's required under the Electoral Count Act is that there are procedures for doing that. And they couldn't follow those procedures because they were replacing people without the consent of the governor, things of that nature. Also in Pennsylvania, I believe it was Pennsylvania, there was a call where, and there's a text of this, where electors were pushing back on this and also wanting to be covered if there was liability and, you know, to be indemnified and things of that nature. And they wanted like statements in their certificates, basically saying you're only going to use this if, you know, you win these lawsuits. And there was a text chain with some of the people who are carrying out this scheme for President Trump. Basically, it ended with these people should be shot because, and then we can't let this snowball like this, otherwise we're going to have to do this in all the other states.
Again, your recollection.
I'm sorry. I don't think he said these people should be shot. I think they said whoever put this slate together should be shot. I think that's what it said.
Well, I think it is one of the reasons the Pennsylvania fake electors didn't get prosecuted was because they pushed back and said, we're not going to sign this unless you include language saying that this will only be used if their court cases say that we are the real electors. In your investigation, did you find that the people who were conspiring with the president to push this plan were telling electors one thing and then using their certificates in another way?
Yes, the electors were told that they would only be used in these circumstances, and as you know, other ways of overturning the election fell away, and as President Trump and his co-conspirators became more desperate, they came up with even more obviously illegal ways to try to stay in power, and it eventually devolved to, let's just say that these are the electors, regardless of whether any court has said so, the governor has said so, the people of the state and most have said so, and they didn't go back to electors and say, hey, we're going to use your, I know we told you we were only going to use this if we won a lawsuit, they just went ahead and used it. I mean, I think, again, even among the fake electors, there would have been witnesses, I'm thinking of one witness in particular in Georgia, who I thought would have been very powerful of, I would never have done this if I thought they were going to use my name to overturn the will of the people, just because one person said so.
Okay, I mean, there were other efforts in Pennsylvania. We had the very famous Four Seasons Landscape Day press conference, which is famous to this day. But there was also a meeting that Pennsylvania State Senator Doug Mastriano hosted in a hotel in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania around Thanksgiving weekend. So, well, things between the certification in Pennsylvania and the presentation of the electors in DC. So even though it was framed as a hearing, Giuliani attended that event and ended up speaking to promote some of these falsehoods about election fraud or wasting votes or whatever, and made it sort of a rally. Donald Trump even called into this event and claimed that he had won Pennsylvania by a lot. Are you familiar with that event?
I do recall that. I think that's in our final report.
I believe so, yes. Did you uncover anything in connection with that event with respect to what they were trying to do with Pennsylvania votes?
Well, I think they were calling them hotel hearings, and it's because they couldn't have hearings actually in the legislature, and so I don't think Pennsylvania was the only state where that happened. Now, there's obviously nothing illegal about having a political rally or having a meeting of people of one political party. Our case was about knowingly false fraud claims.
Right, yeah, it did appear to be more of just some of the kind of performative stuff that we see here where they try to make something out of nothing. Well, I want to thank you for your testimony, for your work, for your integrity, and that of your entire staff, who I know worked extremely hard and with great integrity. And wholly support your request to testify before the American people. I would really like to see that. Americans' tax dollars, including my constituents, have funded your investigation, and I think that they should hear from you directly about what you found and not have your testimony hidden from them. So, thank you.
On another state, on November 20th, Mr. Trump called Republican legislators from Michigan to the White House and urged them to remove the Biden electors and replace them with electors that would elect Trump. They, subsequent to that, made a statement that there was no evidence for that and went back and the electors were certified as the votes had indicated they should be. Subsequent to that in December, there was an effort to create fake electors. And in fact, on December 14th, when the electoral colleges meet in all the state legislatures, there were 16 fake electors in the basement in Michigan, and 4 of them tried to get into the Capitol to overturn the election. Did you look at that whole phenomena?
We did.
And what was your conclusion? What was the, how would that have played, if at all, in your prosecution?
Well, I think that event you're referring to, and I think we interviewed some of the law enforcement officers who were there that day when they were trying to get in. What they were doing and what the email traffic among co-conspirators showed is they were trying to mimic the procedures that are required by the Electoral Count Act, but they couldn't mimic them. And if I recall, the email traffic on this started with, we have to follow these procedures. And then when it became clear they couldn't follow all the procedures, it was like, well, do the best you can to follow as many as you can. And so I think, if I do recall, certain states, it may have been Michigan, that the electors had to convene in a certain government location. And so as a result, I believe there may have been a state official involved in trying to get them into, if I'm thinking of the right situation, get them in there so again they could mimic the procedures, even though they were not the electors that represented the will of the people, how the vote was actually counted.
Thank you.
I know we're getting close to our hour, about 5 minutes left, so I want to end on asking about, and can you just summarize for us the actions that Mr. Trump took with Vice President Pence? What did Donald Trump want Vice President Pence to do to overturn the election results?
Well, ultimately, he wanted him to just hand him the election to say he won. There were different proposals that President Trump and his co-conspirators put to Mike Pence, but in essence, he wanted Mike Pence to impose his own choice about who should be president over the will of the American people who voted in the election.
Was one of those ways that Donald Trump tried to pressure Mr. Pence was to reject the lawful electors' certificates of their votes during the electoral counting process? Was that one of the ways that you recall?
That's correct.
How did Mr. Pence respond back to Mr. Trump's pressure about rejecting the lawful elector certificates?
I think Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence, falls into the category that I described before. He did something that was very hard to do. He went against his party. He paid a price for it. But I think, again, someone like that putting country over party, I think he would have been an effective witness. He did not agree to go along with it.
Did you have the opportunity to interview Mr. Pence as part of your investigation?
Can we stop for 1 second?
We go off the record. Go off the record, yeah. I'll repeat my question. Did you have the opportunity to interview Mr. Pence as part of your investigation?
I think the answer to that question might involve 6E, and so I'm not going to answer that.
Going back to the response that you just talked about with Mr. Pence's response to President Trump's pressure, is this yet another example of evidence that showed Mr. Trump knew or should have known that what he was saying to the American public was false regarding the election of 2020?
Yes. The Vice President was one, and this is alleged in our indictment and our filings, was one of several people saying he was not seeing the outcome determinative fraud that Donald Trump was claiming.
And what would have happened if Vice President Pence would have gone along and refused to count the lawful elector certificates?
Well, thankfully we don't know, but I would say that he and the other people who stood up and said, I'm not going to do that, may have changed the course of history in terms of our country, of having an election where someone took power in our country who didn't actually win the election. So, as I said, I think it took a lot of courage on his part. He's also someone who, as you all know, when the attack on the Capitol happened, he wouldn't leave. People wanted him to leave. And I think, again, that reflects very well on him.
My last question, I know earlier when you were talking to the majority, there was this discussion of First Amendment issues with Mr. Trump talking about these false claims of the election. Do you remember that discussion?
Yes.
And during our hour, we talked a lot about the knowledge that Mr. Trump had, one, that he had lost the 2020 election, and two, that what he was saying to the American public was false about the 2020 election. Can you help now bring us full circle on how you analyze the First Amendment claims with the knowledge of the fraud that Mr. Trump was putting out to the American public in 2020 and 2021?
Sure. From a legal perspective, this is really quite clear. I think all of us want to make sure people's First Amendment rights are not abridged in a way that they shouldn't be. I think I certainly feel that way. I'm sure everybody in this room feels that way. But there is a very clear carve-out for fraud in our case law. Supreme Court, I think there's one case, is the Stevens case, talks about that, and there are others. And so when you're committing a fraud, meaning you're not just saying something that's untrue, you're saying it knowing it's untrue, or with reckless disregard for the truth, that's not protected by the First Amendment. People commit crimes all the time using words. And when someone commits a fraud, an investment fraud, or someone commits an affinity fraud, where you try to gain someone's trust, get them to trust you as a general matter, and then you rip them off, you defraud them. That's all words, but it's not protected by the First Amendment. And in a lot of ways, this case was an affinity fraud. The president had people who he had built up, who had built up trust in him,